Thank you. I was waiting for that. So, exercise. Why is it important? Well, we just heard how important diet is, and exercise is going hand in hand with that diet. And we know that it's good for us to exercise. But why is it good for us? How often should we do it? What should we do? What level of exercise do we need to do? What pace do we need to keep? And how do we get around the difficulties regarding starting to exercise? And then, of course, maintaining the exercises when we've got to that point where we can actually do it. And exercise is not only important for lupus patients, it's important for all of us. So we'll start with a bit of logistics as usual. Please ensure that your microphone and video are turned off. Please turn your microphone and video on only if you're speaking. Please be aware that this session is recorded. Only use the raise hand function on the bottom middle of your screen if you absolutely need to get our attention during sessions. We will respond in chat. Use the chat function to ask any questions or for any comments you may have. Please be patient with us. We will ensure your questions are answered. If you have any technical problems, try logging out from Zoom and logging back in. So we're going to begin with a small quiz to know a bit more about our audience. So can you launch the quiz? Thank you. So do you regularly exercise? Yes, every day, at least 30 minutes. Yes, not every day, but at least one day out of 2. Yes, once or twice a week. And of course, one is missing. The no is missing. We just assume you all exercise. Okay, thank you for answering anyway. So yes, every day at least 30 minutes. That's 44% of you. It's quite good actually. Yes, not every day, but at least 1 or 2 days out of 1 day out of 2, 22%. And yes, once or twice a week, 33%. So it looks like you are quite active actually. Now let's move on to the next quiz and see what you feel is exercise. So for you, which one of the following represents exercise? And you can choose more than one answer. Walking the dog for 30 minutes, walking 20 minutes at a good pace, jogging 20 minutes, a yoga session, doing one of Lupus Europe's exercise videos, which I hope you all know, going to the fitness center, doing a physical activity that gets me a bit short of breath. Please submit your answer.
I think it looks like it shows single choice.
Yeah, I can see that, yeah. Oops, sorry, that was too quick. As soon as you feel like we have enough answers, you can share, yeah. And most of you say doing a physical activity that gets me a bit short of breath, 44%, yeah. Some say walking the dog for 30 minutes, walking 20 minutes at a good pace, jogging 20 minutes. So, and then I guess this all depends on how you actually look at exercise, because normally walking the dog and yoga are not classified as exercise, but they are good for you and good for your health. So if that's what you can do, it's great. For the going to the fitness room or the gym, it depends on what you do while you're there. So if you actually exercise, that's good. But if you only go there to go there, then it's not enough. Okay, so we have a third quiz for you. Do you know what types of exercise are recommended for lupus patients? And here you can also check more than one. Either yes, no, or I would like to know more. Please submit your answers. When you feel like we have enough answers, you can share. Yes. So the majority of you said yes, and you would like to know more. Wonderful. Just the answer I was hoping for, because we're so lucky that we have Dr. Tom O'Dwyer with us today, who is going to tell us a bit more about exercise and exercising when you have a rheumatic disease or lupus. So Dr. Tom O'Dwyer is, in 2016, he completed his PhD entitled Physical Activity and Fitness in Ankylosing Spondylitis in Trinity College Dublin. Subsequently, Dr. O'Dwyer lectured at the Department of Clinical Therapies in the University of Limerick and began work as a postdoctoral research fellow with the discipline of physiotherapy of Trinity College Dublin. Dr. O'Dwyer is a chartered physiotherapist with domestic and international experience, working in interdisciplinary teams in acute settings and outpatient clinics. A member of the IS Society of Chartered Physiotherapists since 2015, he has been on the committee for the Rheumatology Clinical Interest Group. His current research interests are in physical activity, exercise, and behavior change interventions among individuals with musculoskeletal and rheumatic conditions. With a BA in Communication Studies from Dublin City University, Dr. O'Dwyer is also interested in using technology to solve contemporary healthcare problems. In his work in the e-health sector, Dr. O'Dwyer brings a blend of clinical and academic experience to develop and implement care pathways for individuals with chronic conditions. Now, as you can hear, that's quite an introduction, and I think he's very, very suited to address our talk today. So please, Dr. O'Dwyer, could you give us your presentation? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you. And just your presentation.
Are you able to see you're able to see my screen?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm not sure if my camera was on at that time, but I was certainly blushing when you read all that out. Thanks everyone for joining for this talk on exercise. It's a real honor and a pleasure to have you here. Delighted that some of you say that you know about exercise, but want to hear more. Otherwise, I think the talk would be a little bit redundant for me. I'm not going to go through my bio again, but I'm just going to mention that I am based here in Dublin. I am a physiotherapist by training, so a lot of what I'm going to say is going to have that bias layered onto it. I've done a lot of research in physical activity and exercise across a few different rheumatic conditions. There isn't a vast quantity of research in exercise in lupus, so I'm going to have to at times borrow from other work we've done and looked at in ankylosing spondylitis, rheumatoid arthritis, and so on. Just one disclosure to mention at the top that I work for a private research company that looks into how genetics affects certain conditions, and there I'm the program manager for rheumatic research programs. Okay, so when I give talks about exercise in certain conditions, I like to start by going back and looking at when the first kind of literature started to appear discussing exercise or physical activity. And with lupus, you don't have to go back that far. Certainly compared to rheumatoid arthritis or ankylosing spondylitis, this is the first time that I've been able to use pictures that I've been alive during the period that they were taken. So back in 1989, you kind of start to see some of the first kind of published pilot studies looking at exercise in lupus in a more kind of systematic way than would have been reported previously. And from this early study from the States, it was an 8-week aerobic conditioning program, and they found that people in the intervention group had that they increased their aerobic capacity by 19%. They had a decrease in fatigue. There were minimal kind of exacerbations of kind of joint pain. But generally, people found this to be a very positive experience, with 70% having more energy, improved psychological well-being. 50% felt that finding the necessary time for exercise was a significant drawback, but all the exercisers felt that the benefits outweighed the drawbacks. This kind of resonates quite strongly to what people still say nowadays, that finding the time is difficult, but it's worth finding it if you can. But what really caught my eye in this particular paper was the very last paragraph, that the results suggest that well-selected patients can benefit from aerobic conditioning without exacerbating disease activity. The results goes against the conventional wisdom, which dictates that patients with inflammatory disease should rest, and it deserves further study. And I think that's important, that it's only 30 years or so that there's been a change in how exercise has fitted into the care of people and the lives of people with lupus. So we're dealing with a relatively short span of time to accumulate kind of scientific evidence for exercise in lupus. So just to recap on what Jeanette had mentioned, that we're going to try and touch upon some of the questions that are listed here, and I'll diverge a little bit into areas that I think are important to mention, and then we'll have time for a question and answer afterwards as well. So I like this quote when I saw it, because it speaks to some of the ambiguity that exists around exercise in all conditions. So walking I can do, exercise forget about it. And I think it says a lot that with my physio hat on, I can see walking as being exercise. And I think some of you who answered the question 2 earlier on found that walking the dog for you is exercise, and it depends on the size of your dog, and it depends on how fast you're walking, I suppose, are the key features. But it's a good way of kind of introducing what that maybe is and isn't, and how that relates to something called physical activity, which is the broader concept, which is any body movement produced by skeletal muscles that result in energy expenditure. So it includes lots of things. So active transport, exercise obviously is a subset of that, but active work, leisure activities that get you moving, or even domestic and household chores. So physical activity is quite broad, whereas exercise is a subset that's planned, structured, repetitive, and has as an objective to improve or maintain physical fitness. So I guess the more obvious kind of examples of this are do this activity this many times at this intensity, this many days a week, and so on. Just to tidy up then, physical fitness is a set of attributes or your characteristics that allow you to be physically active. So your strength, your endurance, your flexibility, and so on. So I think it's important just to make sure that we're all on the same page certainly for this particular talk. And a side note on sedentary behavior, which is any waking behavior where you're really not spending any energy at all. So for the next 30 minutes or so, you're going to be falling into this category, unfortunately, or you'll be sitting or maybe standing listening to me. But sedentary behavior isn't necessarily the opposite of physically active. You can be physically active, but also have a lot of sedentary behavior. I myself would fall into that category because my exercise tends to be in a confined period of time, and then for the rest of the day I have a desk-based job primarily. So to the first question then, should people with lupus exercise? And looking around some of the online resources, advocacy groups, including Lupus Europe and EULAR and different rheumatology groups all around the world would really support this. And there are many kind of excellent online resources, either articles or videos that are I suppose are great because they're vetted by agencies and organizations who know what it's like to prescribe or to recommend exercise for a specific patient group, in this case lupus. So these are great resources, and these organizations would certainly be pushing and recommending exercise as part of a more holistic and overall approach to management. if we look at the literature, well, we did exactly this maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago at this stage, maybe, where we looked at all of the exercise trials that have been published looking at lupus, and we tried to pool them together to see what the evidence base would suggest with regard to recommending lupus. And the first thing we were curious about really was, had the initial hope that lupus wouldn't cause any adverse events or flare up the condition, did that seem to hold through when we had 30 years of exercise trials? And that seemed to hold up, in that there were only a few exercise-related injuries, and I'll talk to those a little bit later. But in general, it was safe and well tolerated. The exercise programs varied a lot, so it's difficult to say this exercise or that exercise specifically, but if you take them collectively, the exercise programs did improve aerobic capacity and cardiovascular function. It didn't seem to reduce overall risk factors for cardiac and cardiovascular risk, which is, as we know, a big issue in lupus. That's not to say it doesn't, but the trials haven't shown that yet. And then we also found that exercise had positive influence on depression, lowered symptoms of fatigue, and as part of it's more likely that part of a multimodal approach, this would work best. So not just aerobic, not just strengthening, not just flexibility, but a combination of these is likely to be the best kind of approach, but the best protocol hasn't been determined. There's lots of caveats that go with this review, in that there are only 10 studies that met our criteria and that had a robustness that we felt confident that we could stand over. So this is something to bear in mind. And just to expand on the safety, exercise is never without risk, and that goes for any exercise done by anybody. There's always risk associated with it, even if it's a non-contact sport. It just takes one tree root or one sudden change of traffic lights to stop suddenly, to twist, to turn, to sprain an ankle, for example. So, but like all risk, it can be managed. When it comes into lupus, like I said, it was shown to be safe and well tolerated. It's the adverse events that were reported that were linked to the exercise specifically were transient joint pain, disease flare-up, which settled quickly, or worsening fatigue. Worth bearing in mind that most of the trials in the literature will stratify and exclude people who are perceived as high risk. So that's something to keep in mind. You can't just go by the published trials. There are certain groups that were excluded and on which we don't have a huge amount of evidence. So what can you do to maximize safety then? Well, you should always seek out help with professionals who ideally have experience with lupus, and these can be physiotherapists, but ideally it's a multidisciplinary team, because exercise on its own will have benefits, but it's going to be much better if it's incorporated into a team that can manage, like, for example, your rheumatologist and pharmacist who are managing the actual underlying pathology of the disease through medications, for example, dietitian who will help with the nutrition side of things, and an occupational therapist who can help with the pacing and fatigue aspects. So seek out the professional help, and that will help with the, I suppose, second part of it, which is screening for exercise, where the cardiovascular risk can be established for each individual. The dominant clinical features and comorbidities can be established. Medications can be reviewed. Physical fitness can be assessed. And one of the challenges with lupus is that it is so different from person to person that there is no one size fits all, but all should be screened, so the appropriate exercise can be found. And that leads to a personalized exercise program. So the more and more we're moving towards personalized medicine, and be that prescription or be that exercise, the closer you can get to something that is uniquely tailored to an individual, the better. With exercise, it has to have the flexibility to change, There's not going to be one exercise prescription for one person that is set and then maintained for forever. It's going to obviously have to adapt and evolve over time. And part of that is to do with the disease course of lupus, where you're going to have flares, but it's also to do with sports and exercise medicine and physiology, that you have to change your exercise programs to keep them effective. And all of the exercise programs follow best available evidence. So looking at maybe at some of the benefits that are reported by people with lupus themselves, this is kind of a good way to summarize it, that there are general benefits. So it's good for your heart, and these are just selected quotes, but being active helps control weight. It's good for disease prevention, considering that so many people are linked to obesity. Breathing wise, if you exercise more, then you breathe better. Mentally, you feel a lot better and happier when you exercise. It helps you to feel better about yourself. So there's a kind of a self-image part of it there that's important. And my brain is clearer. I'm able to focus better. And perhaps some of you on the call here will kind of identify with some of those aspects of the general benefits. In terms of specific benefits for lupus, maybe some of these quotes will also have kind of come to mind, and maybe things that you've experienced. That, for example, these questions: will I need new knees? I'm afraid of steroids. I fear heart problems. Walking and exercise will help me avoid these. Exercise is essential for everyone with lupus. People with this illness can easily become depressed because of how it affects their life and because of the medications. But if you can still exercise, then it shows that you're not as sick as you think you are. It gives you more mobility and flexibility. It will boost your energy and give you stamina. It's especially important for people on steroids because of osteoporosis, and exercise is the #1 thing you can do because you need to keep moving to keep your muscles and bones moving. So now, this is where I want to put in a slight caveat here, that these are people's individual experiences with it, and for the people that have reported these and whose quotes these are, it's true to their lived experience of exercising with lupus. Not everything here would necessarily have been captured in the clinical trials, so that's worth keeping in mind as well. But I think it's a case here that the trials haven't sought to capture. It's difficult to capture a boost of energy, or it's difficult to design a trial of just lupus patients who are on steroids and check them for osteoporosis. The trials tend not to be designed that way. So I'm not saying that these quotes are wrong. What I'm saying is that there isn't necessarily an exercise trial that demonstrates this, but that may or hopefully will come in the future. So then to the question, what kind of exercise might be beneficial? I don't like doing this, but I need to answer this with a couple of questions of my own. So, well, what are you trying to achieve? Because if you're trying to maybe get into cycling, well, then that's going to be a different exercise to if you want to increase your flexibility, or if you want to be able to walk your dog for 10 minutes and then 20 minutes and 30 minutes. So the goal is important here in terms of picking the exercise. And then the second one that's really important is, what do you like and what do you not like? Because I could have the best exercise, but if you hate it, well, then that's not the right exercise for you. So swimming is a good example here. That, like, swimming is a non-loading exercise, so it's low impact, so it's going to protect the joints. And but if you don't have access to a swimming pool anywhere near you, or if you don't know how to swim, or if you just don't like the water, well, it's not the exercise for you. But in terms of what's in the trials that I mentioned earlier, so walking, cycling, jogging, swimming tend to be the cardiovascular modalities that have been looked at. Stretching is usually incorporated in some capacity, and resistance training tends to be either isometric or progressive resistance training with weights. So that's what's kind of been assessed in the trials for exercise for lupus. But there are lots of other ways to go about deciding what exercise. And if you're looking to improve health-related physical fitness, well, there's a huge variety of exercises, depending on whether you want to improve aerobic exercise, resistance exercise, flexibility, neuromuscular control, and there's lots of great guidelines from different bodies, like the ACSM. There's the WHO have recommendations. National organizations have recommendations. So all of this is to say that if you're looking for health-related physical fitness, well, there's good advice out there, but it's not tailored for lupus. So you need to think more broadly and kind of apply exercise principles. So the approach that I tend to take myself, and that we've kind of looked at we haven't looked at it in lupus, but we've looked at it in spondyloarthritis, like let people pick their own exercise and then build the program around that. And then you end up with a huge variety of maybe not strictly defined exercise programs, but physical activity programs that are adapted to what people are interested in. So if nature photography is your passion, you can build a program around that. That probably will be more sustainable than giving an exercise prescription, which is go get a gym membership and do this program. In terms of what exercise should be avoided, this is easier to answer. So exercise that can be personalized. So the generic kind of exercise approach that hasn't been tailored, that doesn't take into account your individual features of lupus or your disease activity level, that doesn't take into account your physical fitness, that doesn't take into account your physical activity levels, and that doesn't take into account your individual circumstances. For me, these are exercises that should be avoided. And then exercises that don't follow exercise prescription recommendations and guidelines. You can have the right exercise and do it incorrectly. So I'm delighted that I included this paper, because I think it's really interesting. It was a survey that maybe some people have been on the call have been involved in, where there was a large survey sent out to European patients with lupus, and I just picked out a couple of the features here. So like 81% having reporting disease manifestations that affect the joints is huge, and it's going to have a huge impact on lupus exercise. 41% affecting muscles. So you need to be careful, and obviously there's a need to adapt to all of these symptoms and features. But when people with lupus talk about what they regularly experience, there are other features that beyond the kind of systems that I listed previously, like fatigue, sun sensitivity. These are going to come into how you prescribe exercise. And fatigue is obviously a huge one, but sun sensitivity is obviously going to be something you need to think about. And you can probably go through the majority of the features listed on this slide, and each one has a slight adaptation. Osteoporosis has been mentioned a few times already in the talk. Weight-bearing exercise or resistance exercise is one of the recommendations for maintaining bone health. You need to adapt based on the person's physical fitness. And I've mentioned the health-related physical fitness that people have: cardiorespiratory, muscular, body composition, flexibility. But there's a whole other skill-related fitness that need to be thought about, and these are more related to the tasks that you need to do for your exercise. So if your chosen exercise is a dance class of some kind, well then agility, balance, coordination come into it. Same with Tai Chi, same with basically any program that you can think of is going to have a skill-related component, and that needs to be adapted to the person's ability. In terms of the physical activity of the individual, these kind of 5 studies that I've highlighted here have reported the general physical activity levels of people with lupus, and just selecting a few here. So 30% in the US did not perform any 10-minute bouts of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And that's important because moderate to vigorous physical activity is what we think has the most health benefits associated with it when it comes to general physical activity. So if you're walking your dog for 5 minutes, 5 minutes probably isn't enough. 10 minutes is the minimum kind of unit of currency you should be dealing in. So 30% aren't achieving that at all. From Sweden, for example, at least 20% meet the guidance. 2/3 in Italy aren't sufficiently active to meet the guidance. 10% meet the guidance in Canada, and another study from the US, only 28% meet the goals of 150 minutes. All that to say that if someone is new to exercising, you can't go from 0 to 150 minutes per week overnight. You need to tailor it and adapt it. And then individual circumstances, we all know these general barriers to exercise: lack of time, bad weather. And if I don't know if anyone is on the call is from Ireland, but like our weather changes 4 times a day. So you need to have adaptations in place to handle the weather, motivation, comorbidities, lack of access to resources. This all comes into it. And then there's the barriers caused by lupus that we've talked about already: symptoms, fatigue, other features of lupus like joint pain, muscle pain, but also the flares that will periodically occur. And all of these are barriers to exercise. And 78% believe that lupus impedes their ability to exercise. And that in itself says that, well, there's going to have to be changes to what the standard recommendations would be. People have avoided physical activity because they didn't want to exacerbate. And here we're talking about a fear. Fears and beliefs and attitudes towards exercise are really important, and they're important conversations to have when you're starting to prescribe exercise. The encouraging part from my perspective anyway is that 92% thought that physical activity would ultimately improve their lupus symptoms if they could overcome the initial hurdles. And this is an important, it's an important point in I suppose the clinical journey of someone with lupus, that there's a moment where the time will be right for the supporting multidisciplinary team to help somebody overcome those initial hurdles, identify them and adapt to them to get them on the path. And once the person is empowered to be on that path and deal with those barriers that can seem insurmountable at the start, well, then you've got a much better chance of succeeding in the short and longer term. So how do you start if you're not exercising today? Well, the first part is what I've mentioned already in terms of approaching this. Talk to professionals, ideally who've experienced in lupus. Go to a trusted team of people, and these are people that you're going to go back to over time, maybe quite frequently at the beginning as you start on the exercise journey, but then less frequently. But they're there if you need them for adaptations and for changing things. Get your pre-screening assessment done, and make sure that you have a personalized exercise program. Downloading a Couch to 5K program, for example, is good. Is a good intention, but I would caution that if it's the first time doing it, then you need to make sure that it's adapted to whatever you need specifically, and ideally that's done with your health professional support. And these are more general, I suppose, tips and tricks is what we called them when we were planning this session, but maybe let's call them tips rather than tricks. We're getting close to Halloween, and tricks has maybe a different meaning, but these are maybe tips, and they kind of borrow from psychology and health psychology as much as they do from physiotherapy. So setting goals and expectations is really important. So being realistic about what you can do today, what you hope to achieve, and be realistic when you reach a plateau and you can't push any further. Smart goals are, I think, are fairly common, that they're specific goals, measurable goals, they're achievable, they're realistic, and you have a time frame that you can work towards. I've touched on this earlier, so pick something that you enjoy. Again, we're talking about something here that is a lifestyle change, and it's something that you're going to carry forward with you, hopefully for the rest of your life. And picking something you don't like is a bad start. I wouldn't even recommend that you start with something that you dislike, hoping that you will grow to love it. I think it's better to start with something you enjoy and build around that and branch out. Monitoring your progress is something that can be done in many different ways, either externally by health professionals, by peers, by your watch, like a sports watch. And I think there was a session on wearables. That's a nice way to monitor your progress in terms of your fitness, but you should also be monitoring it in the broader context of changes in disease activity and medications and so on. Be incremental and be progressive. So the moment that you start to do the same things and it gets comfortable, we know from exercise medicine prescription that, well, then you're not going to continue to make gains. You need to change things up a little bit, challenge yourself. This, to borrow from the bone health side of things, that your bones adapt to the stresses that you put through them. So if you put a force through your bone, it'll adapt. If your muscles pull on the bone, it will adapt. But if you keep putting the same force through it, it doesn't need to adapt anymore, and so you're not going to be as successful with that program. And that can apply to lots of different features. Try and make exercise social. If you've got a peer network, that sense of obligation that you have to somebody and not wanting to let them down, that can be a motivation on the days that it's difficult to do this. And but it also makes it more fun. Your social time can overlap with your exercise time. There are lots of facilitators for exercise out there that you can try and work in and leverage. You need to pick your moments. Not every day is a good day to start exercising. Generally you want your lupus symptoms to be nicely under control. You need to make sure that it's a good day. There's a good plan in place. You need to figure out what works for you. You don't need to do that on your own, but there's going to be a period of trial and error while you find what you like, what's comfortable, find your right level. You can get there quicker through assessment and figuring out what the right fitness level is for you. But it's not everything's going to work, and not everything would work first time, and that's okay. And knowing that failing or just it not working out, that's okay. There's lots of other options and different things you can do. And then you hope to get to a stage where you've developed a routine, and that it's not just ad hoc. To a certain extent, there has to be a commitment to exercise, and you have to prioritize it within your life. Like, we know that people are generally short of time. There's family commitments, there's work commitments, and so on. So exercise has to be a commitment within that, and finding where it fits in your routine is important. Having said that routine is important, it needs to be adaptable, and you need to have different plans for your exercise and physical activity, and not beat yourself up if you can't always do plan A. Maybe doing plan B and plan C is okay. And you need to have kind of special strategies and a different approach in times of flare. And generally you want to, well, depending on the severity of flare and what systems are being affected, but you basically need to get reassessed by your team. You need to be more protective of yourself, and you need to drop the intensity of the exercise program, and that will maintain the safety element of things, which is paramount. And then you can, depending on the flare, depending on the person, some people can adapt their exercise and work through the flare. Some people need to pause their exercise until X, Y, or Z happens, and then resume the exercise after that. But those are important elements into kind of developing sustainable long-term exercise plans. And I wanted to touch upon this, and it's a little bit of a busy slide here, just to mention digital health technology. And in the last 30 years, there have been advances in exercise, but we've gone from an analog age to a fully digital age, and that's brought lots of possibilities for managing rheumatic conditions. And this is one of the slides where I need to step away from lupus specific, and this is from rheumatoid arthritis, where it kind of nicely stitches together, I suppose, the different aspects of modern digital health technologies, from electronic medical records that help with decision making of the healthcare team, mobile apps which can help both patients and healthcare professionals, wearable monitors, which I think have been covered in a different section, but these can be very good. Artificial intelligence working in the background to help tailor and individualize programs, and then digital therapeutics and virtual visits, which I think most people are very familiar with now after the 18 months that we've had. No, sorry, I've gone the wrong way there. So if you look at lupus, like this can be adapted quite easily for lupus, and the top integration of electronic health records and mobile health into research is something that I would like to see, because it would allow us to not just ask people about their exercise, but actually get real world data of what they're actually doing versus what they tell the research community they're doing versus what they're doing in an actual clinical trial. All the great resources I mentioned that are available online, that are available on advocacy websites, can be integrated and available digitally. You can make real-time adjustments to exercise prescription if you have real-time data, which would be fantastic. There are an emerging suite of software, I suppose, that allow physios to monitor people's exercise programs remotely and make adjustments in partnership with the person. So this is all really encouraging for getting towards personalized medicine. Just on the side, there was a recent review just in 2020 looking at the mobile health technologies that are out there for lupus specifically, and the number is quite small. I think there were just two apps that were kind of rated as being kind of useful, for want of a better term, within the Apple Store and within the Google Play Store. But this will evolve over time, and it's something to keep an eye out for. And which brings me really to my last slide, and this is I suppose the most difficult aspect of exercise prescription. And I think one of the big challenges ahead is, how do you maintain exercise program over a lifetime? And that's with or without having a chronic condition like lupus. And I've talked to behavioral psychologists who have a special interest in rheumatology and healthcare, and this kind of sums up the discussions, I think, quite succinctly, that it needs to be fun and it needs to be part of your routine, and then it can become a sustainable habit. And once it's a habit, it's much easier to have it as part of your life. What ingredients go into making it fun and making it routine? Well, clearly that's a very personal and individual factors. So a personalized exercise program that is fun and that is led by the person is going to get you to a sustainable program, which hopefully in the long term can help both with lupus, but with the general health benefits of exercise that I spoke about. And so with that, very happy to move and take questions. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dwyer. It was really, really interesting. And I think I saw on the chat questions coming in, and as they were coming in, you actually answered a lot of them. So
okay.
I'll try to pick some.
Yeah, sure.
So one of them was, you mentioned only 10 studies with good methodology exist so far for lupus. So how could we get more so that doctors and physical therapists more actively recommend specific programs for their patients?
That's a great question. The first thing that comes to mind is funding. So funding for the researchers to design the trials. That's one way, or one of the factors that is required. Time is another. I would say that lupus exercise research is probably where rheumatoid arthritis and spondyloarthropathy research was kind of in the 70s and 80s, and that it's taken a while for researchers to get to lupus. And one of the big challenges with lupus is the heterogeneity of the clinical presentation. Like the 10 exercise trials have people with lupus by the criteria, but that is a huge variety of different types of people. So that is a huge challenge in designing a trial. And I think rather than getting lots of more trials, it would be nice to see maybe some stratification within those trials of people who have maybe more renal involvement in lupus nephritis, or people who have more maybe neuropsychiatric features coming through, because that's going to be a different exercise program versus people who have primarily musculoskeletal problems. That's another way that you can slice it. But if you start slicing it up too small, you need many studies.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, then you're into another.
I would also say that a key piece of designing this, though, will be more involvement from groups like Lupus Europe and affiliates, because a lot of the studies that would have been included in that review would have been very well-meaning academics sitting in an office with other academics designing a trial that is not for academics. It's for people with lupus. And,
exactly.
and it's great that in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, it's almost a requirement now of most funding bodies that advocacy groups and people with lupus would be involved in lupus trials, in designing them at the very earliest stages. And I think this is really important. And that will get us more trials hitting the right marks. So if I can give an example maybe of trials that involve going to the gym, that's going to cater, that trial is going to cater to people who have access to a gym and like going to the gym. And it can be a really well-designed trial. It can have great results, but it's still only going to reach a certain subset of people who want to do that. I don't think it would serve a huge proportion, to be honest, because a lot of people veer more towards those general physical activities. And without going back to the dogs again, walking the dog walking the dog is a good example, a good question, because it's part of people's routine. Because if you don't walk your dog, it's like not picking your kids up from school. You've got problems.
Something you have to do, yeah, exactly.
You have to do it, and people do it. So maybe start with a trial that looks at those kind of aspects and says, well, do it for 10 minutes. Don't just walk to the park, let the dog run around. You also walk around for 10 minutes, and you do it at a level that gets your breathing a little bit elevated, or if you have a wearable that gets your heart rate to a certain amount, and that's the trial, that's the intervention. And again, to maybe give an example from what we did with in spondyloarthropathy, it was a physical activity intervention, and it was, the activities were self-selected by the participants, and so I can't say that you have to do this activity or that activity. No, what I can say is that we let people pick their activity and we built the program around that. And that's where we ended up with people who wanted to get back rock climbing, people who wanted to do nature photography, people whose goal was just to be able to run around and pick up and play with their young kids. These are very different goals, but there is a way of building activity and exercise around that can have health benefits. And I think that's what we want to do in the longer term. Now, that's my own personal bias, and if you put me in a room with other academics and with people with lupus, we probably come up with many different ways that you could design a study. But I think those conversations with the right funding is the way to do it.
Yep. Okay, thank you. So you actually also answered the next question. So are trials not using the right measured outcomes? This is where lupus patients could be helping and choosing the best outcomes measures.
Yeah,
so,
and that's a great question as well. One of the kind of in that question is a lot of the trials use composite measures for measuring disease activity, and those composite measures maybe aren't sensitive enough to pick up on some of the benefits because they look at a pooled score. And this is my personal physio practice. The main outcome measure that I would use for the sessions is the participant or patient reported outcome, and it's just a simple numeric rating of 0 to 10, and how effective do you think it's been, or how has it improved your activity, and you pick the activity and how close are you to getting to that activity, and that's the outcome measure. But that's not one that's frequently used in clinical trials, because it
has to be measurable and into Excel sheets and so on. Yeah, exactly.
And I think more objective measures would be useful, and physical activity is self-reported. You can get people saying they hit the guidelines about 60-70% of the time, and they did this in the United States with the general population, and 60 to 70% were hitting the recommended guidelines. And then when they put accelerometers on people, it was actually closer to 8 or 9%.
It's a completely different picture.
So self-report is easier because of it can be done by questionnaire, or it can be done remotely, but it has its limitations. But there are also limitations with objective measures, because not everybody has the equipment, not everybody has a smartwatch, and so on. So but there are loads of ways of doing it, and it's having the discussion, reviewing the literature, and seeing what has proper validated metrics to go with it, what's going to be comparable to other studies. And like, again, they're not my favorite studies to be involved in, because they're quite niche, but there's a lot of value in doing validity trials on the outcome measures that you're going to do before you ever get to doing the trial in the first place.
So I think you already do it, but do you think it makes sense to prescribe exercise as a treatment for lupus?
I think so. Yeah, I think having when you say prescribe exercise, I always think of like an old school written piece of paper with it actually written down. But there is value in having a documented, this is what you and I and the team have agreed is a good approach. This was your idea. We've put the safety net around it, and we've put the recommendations around it. And this is what you have come up with as what you think would work for you. Is that a good prescription? They agree. I wouldn't go so far as to countersigning it and having it as a contract, but I suppose the problem I have with the word prescribed is that it sounds like it's me telling, and that's certainly not the approach here. It's more this is what we collectively think is a good approach. And in that sense, there's a prescription. But it's individualized, and it's arrived at together.
So a physiotherapist as a part of the multidisciplinary team is a very good idea. And I see prescription more as you can actually get this reimbursed because it's part of your treatment. So I'm seeing it as a positive. And I know that some people do actually have exercise as a part of their treatment. and they don't have to pay for it themselves. We're talking about people not having the money to go to the gym and so on. So.
And this is where it's a little bit difficult because it's going to change, and what we have available in Ireland is probably very different to what's available in Denmark or Belgium or wherever your callers are in from. And even I'm in Dublin, big city, lots of facilities, but I grew up in Tipperary, and that's quite different. It's rural, it's remote, you need a car to go everywhere. So the prescription kind of options will vary.
Yeah, of course.
And the local knowledge then is important, coming from the MDT and from the person. Who knows best what resources are available than the person, but sometimes there are things they haven't considered.
So Wendy is saying, I always do too much when I'm on horseback riding. Recently she's able to do it again. I sometimes need a week to recuperate. And also the exercise the physical therapist gives me makes me feel worse. He just gives massages. How can I exercise in a moderate way?
Okay, so there's a couple of things there. And I think probably you've identified maybe one of the issues with the horse riding, that if it takes a week to recover from it, that's probably too long to recover from it, right? And I think if the question is being asked, well, then I think you've hit the problem on the head, and then you need to look at the volume that you're doing. So it depends on the type of horseback riding, and I would never say stop or cut it short, but what activities are in that? Can it be spread out over a longer time? And what do you do on the days that you're not doing it in that week? Are there activities that could be done to kind of speed up the recovery or recuperation? To the second part of that question, in terms of massage has I would think quite a focused role in the program, and I tend to move away from that because of the passive nature of it and the reliance on somebody else to administer it. But it also has a role for some people at certain times. But there's lower level, let's call them exercise, because they're structured and they have a frequency, repetition rate, a hold rate, a duration, and so on. There are lower level exercises that maintain mobility, get the muscles moving, get the joints moving, help with stiffness, can help with pain as well, because you're not in the tension that accumulates and that builds up that cycle can be broken. So perhaps that they are simple exercises that can be done independently as part of a home exercise program, rather than relying on the massage elements.
Yeah, maybe combining them.
Yeah.
So Andreas is asking, do we need all 4 types of exercise: aerobic, resistance, flexibility, and neuromuscular? So
ideally, yes. Ideally, yeah, you need to hit on everything. But again, with finite time, it's not always possible. But I think the discussion with the person will kind of dictate what their goals are and which ones are needed more than others. If somebody is having issues with balance, well then that's going to push you down one route. If someone's having difficulty with their endurance out walking or cycling, that's going to go down another route. But yeah, I think all things being equal, the optimal program would hit upon all of those areas, and then would have task-specific, I suppose, task-specific elements that are related to the activity or sport. And yeah, the evidence is less there. This is for all conditions, for neuromuscular and flexibility, which is funny because flexibility and stretching is basically recommended for everybody with any chronic condition, because it's relatively safe compared to aerobic. But aerobic has been studied a lot more. And yeah, so if you're following just the evidence then, and you want to stack it that way, aerobic, resistance, flexibility, and neuromuscular, but that's not necessarily the order that you need to to build a program in. And then because the evidence isn't there for lupus for some of those components, and it's really not there in general for rheumatology, then you need to go back to your basic principles from sports medicine, and that's where you need to think a little bit laterally and curate that and put it into somebody's program.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This is along the same track. You gave many possible targets for exercise, but they all make sense. Improving cardiovascular risks, improving flexibility, losing weight. So how do we prioritize that objectively?
I would never prioritize it for somebody. I would let them set the priority, see what's important to them, and then see how that fits in with what maybe the health team thinks is important. And because if somebody is dead set on improving cardiovascular fitness and wants to do a short run of 5 kilometers, but the healthcare team know that this is unrealistic, well then we can't let that person leave with that target because it's unsafe, and it's not achievable, and it's setting you up for failure. So for all those reasons, you wouldn't set that as a target. But you can't throw that out. You need to bring it back, and maybe, okay, long-term goal, maybe, but let's get a few other things in position first, and then we can look at that as a target.
Yeah. Makes sense. So can you clarify what MVPA, so moderate vigorous physical activity, is? So is that the goal of real exercise, and how do you know that you are now at that level?
Yeah, so there's I don't want to say it's real exercise, because it's all of those are activities. So the MVPA is activities. You probably are in exercise when you get into that zone, but that's a heart rate, a cardiovascular rating primarily. So your flexibility is never going to get your heart rate into the threshold where you're doing MVPA, but you are exercising in one definition, or one sense of the definition. So it wouldn't be the full guide, but if we're talking about cardiovascular fitness, the simplest way would be the talk test. That if you're just at the stage where you're talking, but it's in shorter sentences than you normally would talk.
Beginning to have difficulties talking.
Yeah, it's challenging you. Your breathing is noticeably increased. That's where you're starting to get into the moderate level. Vigorous obviously is beyond that, and you would struggle to say more than a few words. If you want to get more scientific about it, then you're looking at you've worked out your heart rate max, or your theoretical heart rate maximum, and you're working at certain percentages of that, and that will give you whether you're moderate or you're vigorous, and then you need to bring it back to your goal. So maybe your goal might never to be vigorously exercising. You might be just satisfied with moderate. The reason we talk about MVPA is that a lot of the general health-related benefits of cardiovascular disease for the general public are linked to that part of the spectrum, and that intensity. So the decreased risk of cardiovascular disease, of lifetime risk of certain cancers, mental health benefits, and so on. MVPA is better at getting you those benefits, but that's not to say that light activity doesn't help. Like, something is better than nothing. If you get what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So Helmut is saying, I'm so unfit and need to work in all areas: cardio, flexibility, stamina, etc. So how do I get started? I live in a rural area and have no great amount of spare cash to join gym, etc. Yeah.
So that can seem like a really big challenge, and I don't know if this is a saying where you're from, but there's a question of how do you eat an elephant, and the answer, like, one bite at a time.
Yeah, exactly. Small bites. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you've identified that there's many aspects you need to work on, well, you can't work on all of them at the same time. So pick one, pick a target, pick one that you think is the most important to you, and then start to work on that. the rural location is a challenge, and I suppose if you're in somewhere like Ireland or Northern Europe, where we have short days in winter, like that can even further limit how you can exercise. And then if accessing facilities is a problem, that's a challenge as well. And that's where a good team can help be creative in terms of making best use of the resources that you have available. Like, to do a strengthening program, you don't need to have fancy gym equipment. You can do it with common household equipment and
bottles of water and elastic
things like
bands.
that. Yeah. And like so like a 500 ml liter of water filled up with water is a half kilo. Then get a bigger bottle and make it a liter, and now you've got a kilo. And like it seems low tech, but it is a nice way to start, and it's a good way of trying a certain exercise program before you have to make any investment. So if you find that actually having these weights in my home, where I can just turn around and actually use them, this is working for me, well, then maybe it's worth going the extra bit and getting maybe a range of dumbbells or ankle weights, or there's options out there. If you're more looking at cardiovascular exercise, well, probably walking is the cheapest and easiest, but again, safety, you need to be in the countryside. You need to pick safe trails or safe roads where you can do it, and it's not always the most inspiring if it's the side of a busy road, and you're just going in one big circle and you're on your own. But that's where you get, maybe there's a social support network that you can get, that there's maybe local walking groups. I don't know if you have it everywhere, but here in Ireland, just this morning, Park Run, which is a weekly free 5K walk, run, jog, whatever you feel. You just turn up and you take part, and it's a nice way of combining a regular activity with a fixed timetable, where maybe you can meet someone else to do it, and you get the social support. They give free tracking of your performance, so you can track your performance over time. So that, like, an activity like that, which is free, can, assuming there's one near you, that can be helpful. And it's difficult to kind of go much further than that in this forum without knowing the exact circumstances. But
well, we get the idea of what you mean. Yeah, we have so many questions. So, would you advise a wearable to monitor your exercise, or an app? And the next one actually also hooks into that. How can I use my Fitbit in managing my sporting activity?
Yeah, so I think wearables are a great option. So wearables work for me, and they work for other people who like wearables. Not everybody wants to have a wearable on their wrist. Not everybody likes logging into Garmin or Fitbit or whoever it is. Some people, that form of monitoring doesn't work. But if it does work for you, brilliant. The same principles apply in terms of setting a goal. But with the wearables, you have the benefit that you get kind of objective measures of steps, or in some of the wearables will give you your heart rate percentage, and it will actually guide you as to where you should or shouldn't be exercising. It'll tell you if you're overdoing it. It'll tell you if you're not pushing hard enough. So that can be like almost having a generic coach on your wrist. But generic is something just to always have at the back of your mind, that if it's generic, it's not tailored. But that's something that if it's something you want to use, you can talk to the healthcare team and you can get some guidance. The steps is kind of a fun one as well, because like this idea of 10,000 steps per day is kind of, I flip-flop a little bit in terms of that, because it's a line in the sand. And if it's something that you can't do and you train and then you can do, you've made progress and you've got an outcome measure and it's quantifiable. How much you can link it back to healthcare benefits and where it even came from in the first place is debatable. So I wouldn't get too tied up in knots about not hitting 10,000 a day, but if that's the level that you've got yourself to, and it's a level that you're happy with and it's working for you, well, it's nice to be able to hit that more days than not. And life happens, and some days you do and some days you don't. But if you notice that you're getting 100 steps a day, and that's a problem as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it can be a good incentive to do something, but it shouldn't make you feel guilty by not achieving the goal.
No, and that's the risk. Yeah, Jeanette, that's a good point. It can make you feel bad.
Yeah.
And some people feel that way about support groups as well, in some ways, or local walking groups, that if they feel that they're not, if you're someone who compares themselves to others without knowing the other person's like history of training and so on, that can make you feel bad.
Yeah.
But equally, it works very well for other people as motivation that, well, if they can do it, I can do it. Or these people they're further down the road that I'm on now. If I follow a similar path, I can hopefully get towards where they are. So it can be encouraging as well.
Yeah, it's all about how you look at it.
Yeah. So
we have one here. It's interesting, I think. One trick I heard from someone wanting to jog, but having issues being motivated. She worked with an awful hypnosis to install a trigger that when she would see herself, her jogging shoes, she would want to jog. And it actually helped significantly to improve. So what do you feel about that? Auto hypnosis.
Well,
so self-hypnosis.
I haven't heard that used before. She's fantastic if it works. Against if it's safe and it works, well then don't see any issues with that. I suppose it sounds a little bit like a shortcut to developing a routine or developing a habit. That it's there's an automatism there that you do it and you kick in. So it's like waking up in the morning, you put on your runners, you do it. I think that's good.
Yeah, it's something similar to that. Yeah, and we have a lot of good links in the chat as well. People trying to encourage each other to work out, so that's really wonderful. I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, but I want to thank you so much. It's been a wonderful presentation and with so many great answers to people's questions. So you actually saved us a lot of time for what we're going to do now, which is a workshop. So thank you so much for that.
Not at all.
But before we dive into that, now it's time for exercise.
Yeah.